I have felt sort of publicly bullied a little bit just by, when I read things that clearly aren't true, or that, whichever way someone looks at it, it's a negative side.
For years, she said nothing. But now, at 41, Pippa Middleton finally reveals what truly happened with her husband, James Matthews. And it's not what anyone expected. At first glance, their love story appeared seamless. The media painted a picture of elegance, grace, and enduring stability. The younger sister of the Princess of Wales, stepping gracefully into a life of quiet prestige with a man who shared her values, private, successful, and deeply rooted in tradition. Their wedding was breathtaking, their home in Chelsea enviable, their family seemingly content and untouched by the public storms that often torment others in the royal orbit. But behind closed doors, the silence that once protected their world had become something darker, something heavy. And Pippa Middleton, long the master of discretion, could no longer carry the weight of that silence without consequence. For years, she played the part the world wanted her to play. Dignified, poised, unshaken. The perfect partner to a man who refused the spotlight. A mother focused on her children. A philanthropist who continued to run marathons and raise awareness for the causes she held dear. But as months turned into years, cracks began to surface. First in whispers, then in absences. Then, finally, in the hollow way her smile lingered at events she once loved. Still, no statement came, no comment, no press release, just distance. And then, the absence grew louder than any declaration could. The public, ravenous for clarity, filled the silence with assumptions. Was it another royal rift? A quiet agreement? Or something more heartbreaking, a love that had simply withered in the shadows of public life? The world had questions. But Pippa had never been one to satisfy curiosity for the sake of noise. Until now. Her decision to speak softly, indirectly, but unmistakably, wasn't an attempt to reclaim headlines. It was something far more profound. It was about reclaiming her story. Because this wasn't just a story about a failed marriage. It wasn't just another tale of a woman who loved and lost. It was about control, about the cost of always being composed, always accommodating, always the one who remained silent. It was about presence. The kind of presence that doesn't show up in photographs or headlines, but in the quiet consistency of love that stays when no one's looking. And ultimately, it was about purpose, about knowing when to let go of something that no longer nourishes you and finding the courage to move forward, not as a royal adjacent, not as someone's wife, not as the bridesmaid the world once obsessed over, but as herself. The story of Pippa Middleton's silence is not a tragedy. It is a reckoning. A gentle but powerful unraveling of a narrative she never wrote, but always had to perform. And now, finally, she chooses her own words. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for liberation. To understand this revelation, we must go back to where it all started in a quiet corner of paradise, with a man who didn't ask for her heart, but earned it. Before he was her husband, James Matthews was the man who waited and never walked away. Their story didn't begin with fireworks. It began with a glance, a moment so brief it could have been forgotten, except it wasn't. Pippa Middleton was dating Alex Loden at the time, a former cricketer who had stood by her through the early waves of fame. They were solid in the public eye, their connection, approved by society's unspoken standards. But when Pippa met James Matthews at the Eden Rock Hotel in St. Bart's, a place her future would quietly orbit around, something shifted. James wasn't loud, he wasn't showy, he didn't compete, he didn't even pursue. He simply existed calm, composed, and watchful. When Pippa returned to London, her friends noticed a subtle change. The laughter between her and Alex softened. The spark dimmed. There were no public arguments, no scandalous rumors, just a gradual distancing. But even in that fading space, James remained a presence. He didn't insert himself or try to claim her attention. He simply lingered, like a quiet truth that wouldn't go away. And when her relationship with Alex ended, it was done without drama. A clean break. The world saw it as natural, almost expected. But those who had watched closely suspected something more. something that had been quietly forming, out of sight. Pippa didn't leap into James's arms. She moved on to someone else, Nico Jackson. He was charming, presentable, and polished. Their dates were well documented, their photos a regular feature in glossy magazines. But even then, James never fully stepped away. He was in the periphery, silent, constant. Nico offered glamour and attention, but James offered something deeper, something unspoken. As the months passed, Pippa's smile with Nico started to look like effort, beautiful but hollow. And when that relationship ended in 2015, it surprised no one. It didn't end in bitterness, it simply lost its purpose. Then, and only then, did James step forward. Not with declarations or grand gestures, but with quiet intention. He didn't rush. He didn't ask her to forget the past. He simply offered her a future built on something slower, sturdier, and far more real. Their relationship unfolded in whispers, a soft return, familiar, yet new. It wasn't a beginning so much as a continuation of something that had always been there. They were two people who had orbited each other for years, crossing paths, sharing moments, but now, finally, aligned. What made their connection remarkable was not its speed, but its stillness. It was mature, measured, a love that had waited, not chased. In a world obsessed with spectacle, theirs was a lesson in restraint. James didn't need the spotlight, he only needed her. And in a life where every decision was scrutinized, his presence became her calm. Together, they created a bond that didn't require public approval because it was never built for show. It was built to last. But while the world celebrated a fairy tale engagement, something deeper and more complicated simmered beneath the surface. Their wedding was picture perfect. But what happened after the cameras disappeared? On May 20th, 2017, Pippa Middleton and James Matthews stood beneath the ancient stone arches of St. Mark's Church in Berkshire, surrounded by royalty, nobility, and a sea of flashing cameras. The world watched as the younger sister of the future Queen of England walked down the aisle with the man who had waited patiently in the shadows for years. Everything about the ceremony seemed pulled from a royal fairy tale. Prince William and Kate Middleton smiled lovingly. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle made headlines with their presence, and Princess Charlotte and Prince George charmed onlookers with their angelic roles. But beneath the glamour and glitter, something far more delicate had begun to form an expectation that the love displayed in that one breathtaking moment would last forever. But no one asked what would happen when the spotlight faded and real life moved in. After the confetti settled and the headlines moved on, the couple disappeared into a life many envied, but few understood. They relocated to an exquisite $17 million mansion in Chelsea, a place filled with polished stone floors, a private cinema, and whispers of old money. It was elegant, impressive, a fortress for a family that didn't crave celebrity but couldn't escape attention. It was here they built their new world, one that looked pristine from the outside, but slowly, over time, began to show invisible cracks. In October 2018, Pippa gave birth to their first child, a son named Arthur. The media rejoiced. Tabloids scrambled for photos, profiles, predictions. But behind the scenes, something shifted in Pippa. Her priorities rearranged. She spoke in glossy features about health, discipline, and motherhood. Yet her tone hinted at a growing need for something quieter, something less performative. With Arthur came joy, but also a stronger desire to retreat. The woman who once posed at events and smiled through endless scrutiny began choosing silence. And with the arrival of her second and third children in 2021 and 2022, that silence deepened. Unlike Arthur's birth, these moments passed quietly. No media tours, no baby updates, just subtle changes. Fewer appearances, fewer social smiles. A public fade-out disguised as privacy. It wasn't rebellion, it was resignation. A decision to shelter what she could from a world that demanded too much. But in shielding her children, Pippa may have also started shielding herself. And in that protected cocoon, something else began to unravel, something she hadn't planned for. On the surface, their marriage still sparkled. Photos showed grace. Words remained kind. There were no scandals, no shouting matches captured on camera. no leaked texts or teary confessions. But those who watched closely, those who paid attention to patterns, began to notice what wasn't there. James Matthews, once her silent protector, was showing up less. His absence wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. And just like before, he made no grand announcements, no excuses. He simply stopped appearing. Pippa continued to move through the motions: events, fundraisers, polite conversations, but her light began to dim. The couple that once thrived on quiet harmony now existed in parallel solitude. They weren't fighting. They weren't flourishing. They were simply enduring. A life that had once been filled with hope and intention had become mechanical, predictable, hollow in places where love used to live. It wasn't a sudden scandal or explosive fight, it was the quiet that became unbearable. When love disappears without a sound, what's left behind? At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. A missed charity gala, a skipped school recital, a silent absence from the kind of formal dinners where James Matthews once stood respectfully by Pippa's side. There was no announcement, no conflict made public. Just one less appearance, then another, until eventually, his presence in her world, once steadfast and quiet, became barely a whisper. And still, Pippa smiled. She stood in her elegant dresses, posed for photographs, shook hands, and supported causes that mattered to her. But to those who truly knew her, something had shifted. The warmth in her eyes dulled. The once effortless radiance felt rehearsed. Someone was missing. Insiders began to notice what the public didn't. Pippa, once vibrant and composed, had started to appear strained beneath the surface. She hadn't changed drastically, but rather subtly, as though she was trying to hold together a reality that no longer reflected the truth. Her smile still surfaced at events, but it arrived more slowly now and disappeared more quickly. She stopped mentioning James in interviews. Their shared moments vanished from social media and public outings alike. The man who once stood quietly in the background had now completely stepped out of frame. And then the whispers began. At first, it was mere speculation. Perhaps James was overwhelmed. Perhaps he needed a break from the spotlight. But the whispers grew louder when Vogue Williams, wife of James's brother Spencer, made a seemingly offhanded remark during a podcast. The words were vague, the humor light, but the subtext was anything but. Those familiar with the family dynamics heard it for what it was: a crack in the carefully maintained facade, a public joke that revealed a private fracture. It was the first time an insider had hinted that not everything in the Matthews household was as serene as it seemed. From that moment, silence became the story. James offered no response, no appearance, no defense. He didn't stand up for Pippa, didn't shut down the rumors, didn't reaffirm the bond that once made them unshakable. And in that silence, a narrative began to form, one he couldn't control. The man once admired for his restraint now appeared indifferent, and the woman once admired for her grace was left to navigate the scrutiny alone. For Pippa, the most painful betrayal wasn't loud. It was the steady erosion of presence, the steady absence of a man who had once seemed to understand the pressures of her world. Their love, once built on patience and privacy, now felt more like isolation and avoidance. Friends spoke of brief interactions and forced politeness. Photos of her alone became more common. Even in a room full of people, she seemed distant, like someone searching for a version of herself she'd lost along the way. But this wasn't just a story of emotional abandonment. It was the slow, quiet dismantling of a life built on compromise. James didn't leave physically, but his retreat from their shared world became impossible to ignore. And Pippa, ever the composed figure in public, had no choice but to carry on. Not because she wanted to preserve the illusion, but because that was the only choice left to her. As James faded into the shadows, Pippa began discovering something unexpected: herself. She didn't break down. She built herself up in silence. While the world speculated, dissected, and whispered, Pippa Middleton chose a different path. She didn't run to the media. She didn't issue statements or plead for sympathy. Instead, she disappeared, but not in retreat. It was a recalibration. She poured her energy into what mattered most: her children, her health, and the kind of work that didn't require flashing cameras or red carpets. In the eyes of the public, she had gone quiet. But behind closed doors, Pippa was quietly becoming more grounded, more intentional, and perhaps more herself than ever before. She focused on her role as a mother with fierce devotion. Unlike many public figures, she didn't try to curate motherhood into a brand. There were no staged photo shoots, no glossy interviews about bedtime routines or luxury nursery tips. What she gave her children wasn't visibility, it was stability. That was her power. And even as she kept her family out of the headlines, she continued to support causes close to her heart. Health, fitness, children's welfare. While others speculated about her personal life, she laced up her shoes, ran another marathon, and showed up at charity events not for attention but for impact. Then, almost quietly, she achieved something unexpected. In 2022, while enduring a deeply private emotional storm, Pippa earned a master's degree in physical education, sport, and physical literacy from the University of Wales. There was no press release, no photos in graduation robes, no online celebration. It was a personal victory, not for validation, but for purpose. It was an act of reclamation. While her marriage felt increasingly hollow, she filled herself with something real: knowledge, discipline, and above all, independence. But while Pippa was rising calmly, steadily, James Matthews began facing a different reality. His financial empire, once shrouded in discretion and prestige, was suddenly under a microscope. Eden Rock Capital, the very firm he had named after his family's luxury hotel in St. Bart's, was pulled into a controversial hedge fund collapse, a staggering $51 million investment linked to a fraud scandal. And though James was never accused of wrongdoing, his proximity to the case triggered unwanted attention. The man who once built wealth in the shadows was now facing questions in the spotlight, and he had no answers to offer. Then came the collapse of Party Pieces Pippa's family, business and a brand that once symbolized middle-class ambition. In 2023, the company crumbled under $2.6 million in unpaid debt. Suppliers were left with nothing, and though Pippa had no direct control over the company, her name, once an asset, was now a liability. Headlines lumped her into the failure. Photos of her at elegant galas were suddenly juxtaposed with stories of bankruptcy and betrayal. But again, Pippa said nothing. No press tour to clean up the damage, no denial, no deflection. Just quiet resolve, because while others scrambled to define her story, she was writing her own in silence. Not as a victim, not as a royal accessory, but as a woman who had weathered the loss of love, the sting of public judgment, and the unraveling of legacy, and still found a way to stand taller. And she did it without spectacle, without explanation. While whispers about her marriage echoed louder, another controversy lit a firestorm in their own backyard. Sometimes, the quietest moves speak the loudest truths. Tucked away in the rolling countryside of Berkshire, a path that had been part of local life for generations suddenly disappeared, swallowed not by nature, but by ownership. It began with a locked gate. No announcement, no community meeting, just a cold metal message. You're no longer welcome here. That path, used by schoolchildren, dog walkers, and longtime villagers, had run straight through the land Pippa Middleton and James Matthews now called home. It had been open for decades, a shared artery of village life. But when the couple arrived, something shifted not just physically, but symbolically. What had once been open was now closed, and people noticed. At first, the locals were stunned, then frustrated, then angry. For them, the closure wasn't just about land, it was about loss. A quiet piece of routine was stripped away, replaced by signs and silence. What followed was a battle of perception. To the outside world, it was just a private estate asserting its rights. But to those who had long walked that path, it was a betrayal of trust, a severing of connection. The estate might have been magnificent, but the message was clear. The life inside was no longer part of the world outside. The public had once admired the couple for their grace and reserve, but now the narrative began to crack. Whispers turned to criticism. Admiration faded into doubt. Was this really about privacy? or control? And if such a simple act could trigger so much resentment, what did it say about what was happening behind the scenes? Because just as James Matthews had distanced himself from the community, he had also withdrawn from something far more sacred, his marriage. The locked gate became a metaphor, a symbol of emotional walls being built quietly but firmly. Just as the public had been shut out of the estate, James had slowly shut himself out of Pippa's world. What began as distance became detachment. What once felt like a sanctuary now felt like separation. And in the stillness of that land, a louder truth emerged. Privacy had turned into isolation. For James, silence was survival. For Pippa, it was suffocation. Neighbors began to talk, not just about the gate, but about how rarely they saw James at local gatherings, how often Pippa came alone, how the estate, though grand, felt increasingly cold. And as frustration from the villagers grew, Pippa's internal conflict deepened. She had always believed in balance between public and private, family and freedom. But now, even her home reflected a tension she could no longer ignore. The council took notice. Legal discussions began. Media headlines surfaced. And once again, the spotlight turned toward Pippa. This time not for her fashion or her lineage, but for a decision she hadn't even made. Still, she didn't speak out. She never blamed. But the damage had been done. A community once enchanted by her presence now questioned her place. And somewhere in the middle of locked gates and closed doors, another kind of barrier had formed, one between a woman and the life she thought she'd built. As villagers voiced their outrage, Pippa faced an even deeper betrayal inside her own family's legacy. It wasn't just her marriage falling apart. Her family's foundation was crumbling too. For decades, Party Pieces had been more than just a business. It was the Middleton family's triumph, a modest startup that symbolized ambition, self-made success, and the bridge that carried them into royal circles. Born at a kitchen table and built with relentless optimism, the brand helped define the Middleton image. Relatable, hardworking, aspirational. But in 2023, that image shattered. Under the weight of more than $2.6 million in unpaid debts, the Idol company collapsed. Suppliers were left unpaid, promises broken, and the company that once launched a legacy was now the subject of bitter headlines and public embarrassment. Though Pippa hadn't been involved in the daily operations, her name was inextricably linked to the brand, and when the fall came, she was pulled down with it. The media, relentless and unforgiving, didn't care about the details. They wanted a narrative, and the collapse of Party Pieces gave them the perfect one. Another Middleton under pressure, another golden image beginning to fade. Headlines blurred the lines between accountability and association. Suddenly, Pippa was no longer just the poised sister of the Princess of Wales. She was the face of a family in free fall. Behind closed doors, the collapse hit harder than anyone outside could understand. While dealing with the quiet unraveling of her marriage, Pippa was now also navigating the shame of a public business failure. And James Matthews? He was nowhere to be seen. Once a man who stood firmly, if silently, by her side, he had now vanished completely, not just from society events, but from the spaces where he once mattered most. No charity dinners, no galas, not even the subtle presence that had once made him her anchor. His disappearance wasn't dramatic. It was hollow. A silence so heavy it drowned out every unspoken truth. Their final public appearances told the real story. The body language was stiff, the laughter strained. The warmth they once radiated had gone cold. They posed as a couple, but their eyes were elsewhere. Every photo became a mirror reflecting two people who had once promised forever, but now seemed lost in separate lives. There was no grand announcement, no official statement, just absence. And that absence spoke volumes. One day, the appearances stopped altogether. No more hand-in-hand sightings, no more shared family outings, just a growing void where a marriage used to be. The unraveling wasn't violent, it was surgical, precise, quiet. And in that quiet, Pippa found herself standing alone, not broken, but undeniably changed. The world that once lifted her up was now content to dissect her fall. But she didn't fight it. She didn't chase headlines or try to reclaim favor. Because by this point, she understood something critical. The story the world wanted wasn't hers to feed. She had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. Her dignity, her children, her peace. But Pippa wasn't seeking headlines anymore. She had one final choice to make. They called her Kate's sister, then a royal bridesmaid. Now, she writes her own story. There was no dramatic press conference, no carefully worded Instagram caption, no publicist on standby with pre-approved talking points. Pippa Middleton simply faded into a new chapter 1, built not on palace proximity or curated appearances, but on quiet independence. The silence that once held so much pain now holds something entirely different. Peace. She never issued a statement about her marriage. She never confirmed its end, never tried to defend what had already slipped through her fingers. And yet, the message became unmistakably clear. She had let go. Not with scandal, but with grace. Today, her focus is singular and unwavering: her children. She is present, grounded, and fiercely devoted to raising them in a world that doesn't dictate their worth by last names or public perception. She shields them not just from paparazzi flashes, but from the noise that once consumed her own life. There are no photo ops, no perfectly timed magazine features, just long walks, routine school runs, and the kind of quiet rituals that don't make headlines, but build a legacy far more lasting. Still, she hasn't disappeared completely. Pippa continues her work in mental health advocacy, education access, and physical well-being, not because it earns her press, but because it gives her purpose. While others chase relevance, she builds impact. Her name is no longer associated with party planning guides or society columns. It's tied to real change initiatives that uplift children, support families, and help rebuild the very foundations she once watched collapse. She gives not to be seen, but because she understands what it means to feel unseen, and she won't let others go through that alone. And behind the scenes, through it all, she remains quietly loyal to the woman whose journey shaped her own. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has faced her own health battles, ones that captured the nation's sympathy and fear. And while many wondered where Pippa stood during those moments, those closest knew the truth. She was there, always. Not in headlines, but in hospital corridors. Not in public statements, but in private strength. Because sisterhood isn't performance, it's presence. And that bond, unshaken by media cycles or marriage dissolutions, remains one of the few constants in her life. Pippa is no longer dressing for cameras or smiling for tabloids. She no longer molds herself to meet public expectations. There's no performance left, only clarity. A woman once defined by others is now defined by her own decisions. She moves with intention, speaks only when it matters, and builds a world that aligns with her values, not her past. The transformation wasn't explosive, but it was absolute. From a silent wife to a self-assured woman. From someone who once lived in the royal orbit to someone who created her own gravitational field. Pippa Middleton didn't break her silence with words. She broke it by walking away with grace, strength, and no regrets. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.